The pen was already in her hand when the room went quiet. 5 quotes, 5 experts, 5 men who had spent decades learning the language of engines, and every single one of them read the same sentence: the transmission was gone. Dead. $271,000 to make it right. Charlotte Voss had not built the third largest prestige dealership group in the country before 34. By softening at hard numbers, she had built it by being the hardest thing in the room. Then Maya set a torn scrap of paper on the edge of the desk, quietly, like it might break something. One name, one road no GPS bothered to remember. A 2-car garage with no sign out front and no record anywhere. 8 days before Elliot Graves came back for his car. She put the pen down, and that was the moment everything she knew about being certain began to crack. Charlotte Voss ran Voss Prestige Motors, the way a surgeon runs an operating room, everything in its place, everyone at their best, and absolutely no tolerance for the kind of disorder that cost people something they couldn't get back. She had built the company from a single showroom in her late 20s into the third largest prestige dealership group in the country, and the version of herself that existed on the other side of that achievement was not a woman who second-guessed, overstayed a feeling, or allowed sentiment to slow a decision. She was precise. She was fast. And she had learned somewhere in the blur of those early years that the most expensive thing a leader could carry was hesitation. The office on the 14th floor of the Voss headquarters building reflected all of this without trying to say it. Clean lines, one painting abstract, dark blue expensive, a desk that was always clear by end of day. Charlotte believed that the surface a person worked on told the truth about the inside of their mind, and hers told a story of someone who processed things quickly and completely, and then moved forward without looking back. She had applied that same standard to the Aston Martin DB11. Elliot Graves had been her business partner for 10 years, 18% of Voss Prestige Motors, a handshake before there were lawyers, a presence at every hard table she'd ever had to sit across. He was not the kind of man you bought a watch for. He was not the kind of man who wanted a dinner reservation or a bottle of something old and French. What Elliot Graves wanted, though he would never say it out loud, was to be understood. And Charlotte, who understood almost nothing about sentiment, but everything about precision, had spent 4 months choosing the DB11 the way she would have chosen a strategic acquisition, deliberately exhaustively, and without a single arbitrary decision. The paint was magnetic silver, a finish that shifted between gray and blue, depending on the light, because she had once watched Graves stand at a window for 3 full minutes, looking at a storm coming in off the lake. The interior stitching was dark. Bourbon, not red, not tan bourbon, because he drank it neat and never explained why. The clock face on the dashboard was hand-assembled, the kind of detail most people would never notice, and Graves would notice within 30 seconds. It was a gift that said, "I have been paying attention." It was in her way the most personal thing she had ever given anyone. She had arranged a test drive before delivery, a long one out through the hills north of the city, where the roads curved and the engine could breathe. Graves sat in the passenger seat, with one arm resting on the door, watching the landscape move past the window. Charlotte drove. She kept her eyes on the road and let the car speak for itself, because the DB11 at speed required no salesmanship. They were 40 minutes out on a 2-lane stretch that bent left around a long ridge when the transmission locked. There was no warning. One moment, the car was moving with the low, controlled confidence of something built to do exactly this. The next, a sound came from beneath the chassis, not a bang, not a crack, but a grinding that carried through the seats and into the hands and chest, and then the car simply stopped doing what cars do. Charlotte pulled to the shoulder. She turned the engine off. She turned it back on. Nothing responded the way it should have. The gearbox had seized completely, and there was nothing to do but call for a vehicle and stand on the side of a road in the hills with Elliot Graves and wait. Graves said nothing for a long time. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the mountains in the distance, and Charlotte stood beside the car and said nothing either, because there was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already said more loudly. When the replacement vehicle arrived, he walked toward it, calmly opened the passenger door, and before he got in, he turned back and looked at her with an expression that was neither angry nor disappointed, just level. "I look forward to seeing the DB-11 when I get back from Boston," he said. Then he got in the car. Charlotte stood on that shoulder for another few seconds after the vehicle pulled away. The hills were very quiet. The Aston Martin sat behind her, with its hood down and its engine cold, looking in the afternoon light, like something that had simply given up. She did not feel embarrassment. She had trained herself out of that particular response years ago. What she felt instead was something colder and more specific, the recognition that she had promised something she could not currently deliver, and that the clock had started without her permission. She contacted the first specialist the following morning. By the end of that week, she had 2 assessments. By the end of the second week, 4. She brought in the 5th herself, a man out of Chicago who had worked on every major European mark and whose waiting list was normally 4 months long. She called in a favor, got him on a plane, had him in the service bay within 48 hours. All 5 of them walked around. The car ran their diagnostics, pulled the same data from the same systems, and arrived at the same place. The transmission was gone. Not damaged, not malfunctioning in a way that could be addressed with a repair. Gone as in dead, as in the only path forward, was a full replacement from Aston Martin, and the cost of doing that correctly, parts labor recalibration. The kind of work that a car like this required to be returned to factory specification was $271,000. Charlotte sat with those 5 reports spread across the surface of her clear desk and read each one twice. They were not identical in language, but they were identical in conclusion. 5 different men, 5 different diagnostic approaches, 5 different decades of combined experience, and 1 number. She had been in business long enough to know that when experts converged without coordinating, you listened. She had also been in business long enough to know that consensus among experts was not the same thing as certainty, but the distinction felt academic when the alternative was doing nothing. She called Graves's office on a Thursday afternoon and confirmed that he would be returning from Boston in 8 days. 8 days. That was the shape of the problem. Now not $271,000, not a seized gearbox, not 5 diagnostic reports, but 8 days in a car sitting in her service bay that was not what it was supposed to be. She had the authorization form drawn up that evening. It was a single page, clean, precise, the kind of document her company produced without friction, because she had built systems that produced things without friction. She reviewed it, found nothing wrong with it, and brought it to her desk the following morning with a pen. She had been sitting with the pen in her hand for less time than it seemed when Maya came in. Maya Hartwell had been Charlotte's executive assistant for 6 years, long enough to know when to speak and when to place something quietly on the edge of a desk without explanation. She was young, not yet 30, with the kind of organizational mind that Charlotte had recognized immediately during the interview and had not taken for granted since. Maya did not offer opinions unless asked. She did not interpret situations she had not been asked to interpret. She moved through Charlotte's professional world like someone who understood that the most useful thing she could do was keep the machinery running without adding noise. What she placed on the desk that morning was a torn piece of notepaper. Small, the kind of paper that comes from a pad kept in a kitchen drawer. The handwriting on it was not Maya's, it was someone else's. Slightly uneven, written with a ballpoint pen that had been pressed harder than necessary. Isaac Hayes, Hayes Garage, Oak Creek Road. Charlotte looked at it. Then she looked up at Maya. Maya said, "A friend of my father's. He mentioned it last night when I told him what was happening with the car." She kept her voice flat, informational, the way she always did when she was delivering something she wasn't sure how it would land. He said Isaac used to work for AMG Stuttgart. He said he's never seen anyone who understood transmissions the way Isaac did. Charlotte looked back at the paper. No phone number, no address beyond the road name, no website. She knew that already, because Maya would have checked, and if there had been anything to find, there would have been more on the paper. Hayes' garage on Oak Creek Road existed apparently in the way that certain things exist without asking to be found, without any particular interest in being verified. Charlotte set the pen down on the desk beside the authorization form. She did not pick the pen back up. What happened in the space between setting the pen down and making the call that afternoon was not a dramatic internal negotiation. Charlotte was not a person who experienced decisions as drama. She experienced them as calculation, as the movement of variables toward a most probable outcome. The calculation here was not complicated on its surface. She had 5 expert opinions pointing in one direction and one unnamed garage pointing in no direction at all, only suggested by a piece of notepaper passed through a social connection she had no way to verify. But underneath that surface was something she didn't look at directly. The 5 experts had each run the same diagnostics, read the same fault codes, arrived at the same conclusion, and none of them had mentioned anything that explained why a transmission on a car with this mileage maintained to this standard would fail this completely, and this suddenly. They had diagnosed the outcome without explaining the cause, and Charlotte, who built businesses on the principle that you did not fix symptoms without understanding, systems had not pushed back on a single one of them. She had been so certain they were right that she had not noticed the question they had all quietly stepped around. She found the Oak Creek Road address through a county property record search. It took 11 minutes. She asked Maya to hold her morning, then drove out herself alone in a rental she had arranged specifically for the trip, wanting the unfamiliar car to keep her thinking sharp on the drive out. Unbothered by the muscle memory of her own vehicle, with the notepaper on the passenger seat, and 8 days left on a clock that had not asked her permission to start. Oak Creek Road was exactly what a road looked like when it had stopped trying to impress anyone. Gravel shoulders, tree line close on both sides, the kind of pavement that had been patched so many times, it no longer had an original surface. Charlotte drove it slowly, checking the property numbers against what she had pulled from the county records, and found Hayes' garage. Not by its sign, there was no sign, but by the shape of the building itself, a low, wide structure set back from the road, 2 bay doors facing outward, both of them closed. A single-story house sat attached at the left side, the kind of house that had been added on rather than built with intention. The driveway was packed gravel. There was a rusted metal chair beside the nearer bay door that looked as though it had been sitting in that exact position for years. Charlotte parked, got out, and stood for a moment looking at the building. There was no one visible. No other vehicles, except an old pickup truck parked beside the house. No signage, no window display, nothing that advertised competence or welcomed business or made any effort to explain itself. The only sound was wind moving through the tree line, and faintly, something mechanical from inside one of the bays, a rhythm too quiet to identify, but present. She knocked on the personnel door to the left of the larger bay. The man who opened it was not what she had constructed in her mind during the 40-minute drive out. She had not built an elaborate picture, but she had assembled something an older man, probably someone who had moved slowly into retirement and kept the garage the way some people kept gardens out of habit. Isaac Hayes was somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than a gym. And he looked at her, the way a person looks at someone who has arrived slightly ahead of schedule. He did not introduce himself. He already knew who she was, that much was clear. He looked past her at the road for a moment, then back at her, and said, "Is the car on a flatbed?" Charlotte told him it would arrive within the hour. She had arranged transport that morning. Isaac nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had already decided, and then he said, 7 days. You can be here as much as you want, but you stay outside while I'm working. No questions about what I'm doing until I'm ready to answer them. If you need to make calls, the signal is better toward the road." Charlotte looked at him. "And if I have a concern, then you write it down," he said, "and I'll get to it." He went back inside. She stood at the open door for a moment, not because she was reconsidering, but because she was absorbing the fundamental strangeness of the situation. Charlotte Voss had been the person other people waited for. She had been the person whose schedule was managed, whose time was protected, whose attention, when it was given, was treated as a form of currency. She had walked into boardrooms and conference halls and service centers where people stood when she entered, where conversations restructured themselves around her presence. And now she was being directed to sit outside on a rusted metal chair and wait. She sat down on the chair. It was cold and slightly uneven on the gravel, and she could hear nothing from inside the bay, except the occasional shift of something being moved. The trees made their noise. A bird crossed the sky above the driveway and disappeared into the line of maples. Charlotte put her phone in her jacket pocket and did not take it out for 40 minutes, which was the longest she had gone without checking it in roughly 4 years. On the third day, the bay door opened in the early afternoon. Charlotte was on the chair with a coffee she had started bringing from a gas station 11 minutes down the road. Isaac came to the doorway and stood with his arms crossed, not defensively, but in the way a person stands when they have been thinking something through for a while and have finally decided to say it out loud. "None of them were completely wrong," he said. He was talking about the 5 specialists, though he had never met any of them, and she had never described their reports to him in detail. But none of them were completely right either. Charlotte waited for more. There was no more. He turned and went back inside, and the bay door stayed open for another few seconds before the secondary latch caught, and it pulled to. She sat with that sentence for the rest of the afternoon. It was not reassurance. He had not said the transmission was fine, had not said the diagnosis was incorrect, had not offered any competing conclusion. What he had given her was a structural observation that 5 experts had converged on something that was partially true, which meant there was a part of it that wasn't. She knew how to work with partial truths in business. She knew how to find the edge of a consensus and look at what was sitting just outside it. But she had not been given enough context to do that here. And the absence of context she was beginning to understand was deliberate. He was not keeping her outside to protect his process. He was keeping her outside because her instinct, the moment she saw the car opened up on a lift, would be to interpret what she saw through the framework she already had. 5 reports, 1 conclusion, and that framework was exactly the thing he was trying to work around. She did not like this reasoning, but she could not find a flaw in it. On the 5th day, Maya sent her a message at 10 in the morning. It was a transcript 41 minutes of a phone call formatted as a summary, because the full audio was in German. Isaac had at some point that Charlotte was not aware of placed a call to a former AMG engineer who was now working a consulting role out of Stuttgart. The call had covered, according to Maya's summary, a very specific technical question about firmware. Not transmission firmware in general, but a parameter set used in a particular production batch, a narrow window of vehicles built within a 3-month period. Maya had added a single line at the bottom of the message. The Stuttgart contact confirmed what Isaac was looking for. Isaac's last words on the call per the transcript, "That's it." He said it in German. Charlotte read the message twice, then set her phone face down on her knee. The story had just changed shape. She didn't know yet what the new shape was, but she felt it the way you feel. A room shift when someone opens a window, not the wind itself, but the pressure difference that comes before it. Isaac was not trying to diagnose a dead transmission. He was tracing something upstream of the transmission, something in the way the car's systems communicated with each other, something that required tracking down a firmware parameter from a specific production batch, something, therefore, that was not visible in a standard diagnostic scan, something that 5 specialists each of them running the same standard tools against the same standard parameters, would have had no particular reason to look for. The authorization form was still unsigned back on her desk at Voss headquarters. She had not looked at it since the morning she drove out to Oak Creek Road. On the 6th day, she arrived at the garage at her usual time and found a piece of paper folded and taped to the gate at the end of the driveway. 3 words printed in the same ballpoint hand as the notepaper Maya had placed on her desk a week earlier: "Don't come today." Charlotte stood at the gate and read it twice, as though the second reading might offer something the first had not. Then she walked back to the rental car and got in, and she sat. 1 hour, then another 40 minutes on top of that. She did not drive away. She had tried to understand in the first 10 minutes why she hadn't simply turned the car around and gone back to the office, and the answer she arrived at was this. Leaving felt like a decision she could not undo, and she was not ready to make it, not because she had given up anything by staying, but because leaving would require her to go back to the desk and pick up the pen and commit $271,000 to a repair. She was no longer certain the car needed, and she could not do that while Isaac Hayes was inside a garage a quarter-mile up this road, knowing something she didn't. The rental car's engine ticked quietly as it cooled. The tree line on both sides of Oak Creek Road filtered the afternoon light into long strips that moved slightly when the wind came through. She watched a delivery truck pass on the road ahead, slow for the curve, disappear. At 5:40 that evening, her phone lit up with a number. She recognized the direct line for Graves's personal assistant, a man named Patrick, who had worked for Elliot for years and who did not call without a reason. Charlotte looked at the screen. She let it go to voicemail. She sat for another 5 minutes. Then she called back. Patrick answered on the second ring and confirmed what she had already assumed, that Graves would be returning from Boston on Friday, as planned, and wanted to arrange pickup of the DB-11 directly from her facility that afternoon. He was pleasant about it, efficient, gave her the time window, and asked if there were any concerns she wanted flagged in advance. "None," Charlotte said. "The car will be ready." She said it the way she had said things for 15 years, with the flat, certain register of someone who had never once had to manufacture confidence because the evidence had always been there to support it. 15 years of being right, or being right enough, or being the kind of right that moved companies forward. The voice did not know how to sound any other way, but something underneath the voice knew with complete clarity that this was the first time in her professional life she had made a promise she could not personally guarantee. She had no visibility into the bay. She had no progress report, no timeline update, no deliverable she could verify. What she had was a man who had tracked down a firmware parameter from Stuttgart and said in German into a phone to a person she had never met, "That's it." And she had chosen, with her eyes open, to build her certainty on top of that. She ended the call and sat in the dark of the car for a while longer, watching the tree line, not thinking about anything in particular. Friday was coming whether the car was ready or not. That was the shape of the problem. Now, not the transmission, not the $271,000, not the 5 reports, but the simple arithmetic of trust against time. Charlotte had put everything that carried the name Voss, the reputation, the partnership, the 10 years of accumulated credibility, with the one person whose opinion of the company was not separable from his opinion of her, into the hands of a man she had known for 6 days, in a garage she had never been allowed to enter, working on a problem she had never been allowed to watch him solve. She had done it deliberately. She had done it with her eyes open and her reasoning intact. And she could not, if pressed, tell you exactly when she had stopped asking herself whether Isaac Hayes was going to deliver, and started simply believing that he would. That shift from calculation to faith was not something Charlotte Voss had a practiced relationship with. She had built an entire professional identity on the premise that confidence followed evidence, that certainty was something you earned by verifying, and that trust was extended in proportion to proof. What she had given Isaac was not proportional to any proof he had offered. He had offered her nothing. No credentials displayed. No progress shared. No assurances made. He had offered her only the quality of his attention, the precision of his questions, and the way he moved through his work as though the outcome were not in doubt. It occurred to her somewhere on the drive back from Oak Creek Road that evening that she had met that quality before. She had simply never before allowed herself to be on the other side of it, in the position of the person waiting rather than the person at work. She was in the driveway at 5:45 in the morning. The sky was still dark in the way that is not quite night, a deep settled blue that carries the suggestion of something coming without committing to it yet. Charlotte had not slept well. She had been awake at 4:30, lying in the dark of her apartment, with her eyes open, running through the arithmetic of the day ahead. And at some point, the arithmetic had stopped helping, and she had simply gotten up and driven. The garage was dark. The house beside it was dark. She sat in the rental car with the engine off and waited, and the quality of that waiting was different from all the other waiting she had done on this road over the past 6 days. The earlier waiting had carried frustration in it, the tight-shouldered impatience of someone accustomed to motion. This waiting was something else, quieter, more stripped down. The kind of waiting that happens when a person has run out of alternatives and arrived, finally, at the thing that is simply true, that she had done everything she could do, and the rest was not hers to control. At 6 o'clock, the light in the house went on. Isaac came out of the side door 12 minutes later, dressed the same way he was always dressed, dark work pants, a canvas shirt, boots that had seen years of exactly this kind of morning. He walked to the bay door and lifted it without looking at the car. Then he turned toward Charlotte, who had gotten out and was standing at the edge of the driveway, and he said, "Come in." Those were the first 2 words he had said to her in 2 days. She followed him inside. The bay was lit by 2 work lights mounted on adjustable arms, positioned low over the car and angled inward so that the DB11 sat in a pool of concentrated white light, while the rest of the space remained in relative shadow. The effect was clinical. It reminded her without intending to of the surgical room analogy she had applied to her own office for years, and the recognition of that carried a small irony she didn't have time to examine. The transmission was open, not removed still in the car but exposed. The housing opened, and the internal components visible under the lights in a way that required serious equipment and serious knowledge to achieve without causing additional damage. Charlotte stood beside the car and looked at what she was looking at, which was a mechanism that appeared to her eye completely intact. No scarring on the visible surfaces, no evidence of the hydraulic failure the 5 reports had described, no warping, no burn marks, nothing that corresponded to the language of catastrophic gear failure she had been reading for 3 weeks. She looked at Isaac. "The transmission," he said, "is fine." He said it the way a person states a measurement, not with drama, not with satisfaction, but with the flat precision of someone who has verified a thing and is now reporting it. Charlotte kept her eyes on the open housing. Then what failed? Isaac reached to the workbench behind him and picked up a component she would not have been able to identify by sight, a narrow cylinder, roughly the length of her hand, with electrical leads at one end and a threaded fitting at the other. It was 73 millimeters long. He had measured it. She knew this because he had written the measurement on a strip of blue tape stuck to the workbench beside a small notepad, the way a person documents things when accuracy matters more than memory. "This is an oil pressure sensor," he said. "It sits inside the transmission assembly and feeds continuous pressure data to the vehicle's engine control unit. When the pressure reading falls outside the acceptable range, the ECU interprets it as a system failure and initiates a protective lockout." He set the component back on the bench. This one had been sending a false low-pressure signal for long enough that the ECU locked down the entire drivetrain, not because anything was wrong with the drivetrain, because it believed something was wrong based on data that was incorrect. Charlotte looked at the sensor. Why didn't any of the diagnostic scans catch it? This was the question she had been carrying since the 5th day, since Maya's message about the Stuttgart call, since the shape of things had started to shift. Isaac picked up the notepad from the workbench. The DB11 runs a standard fault code protocol for most system errors. You get a code, you pull the code, you trace it to the source component. But this vehicle came from a production batch, 47 cars built across a 3-month window, where the firmware handling transmission sensor errors was written differently. Instead of generating a diagnostic code, it initiated an absolute lockout and suppressed the underlying fault data. No code, no flag, just a transmission that appeared by every standard measure to be mechanically dead. He set the notepad down. The 5 people who looked at this car were running standard diagnostic tools against standard firmware behavior. They got the output the system gave them, a locked transmission, and they diagnosed the locked transmission. None of them had a reason to look for a suppressed sensor fault in a firmware variant that Aston Martin issued on fewer than 50 vehicles in that batch. Charlotte stood very still. "How did you know to look for it?" she asked. "Because the failure pattern didn't match the mechanical evidence," he said. "A transmission that dies from internal failure leaves evidence. This one left none, which meant the transmission hadn't failed, it had been told to stop." He looked at the car for a moment. "Once you know what you're looking for, you call Stuttgart, and you ask someone who was in the room when the firmware was written whether there's a variant that behaves this way. If there is, they tell you. Then you find the sensor, you verify the false reading, you replace the component." "What does the component cost?" Charlotte said. $840, he said. "Parts and labor," she heard the number. She stood with it for a moment. $840 against $271,000, a 73mm cylinder against a full transmission replacement, 1 suppressed fault code against 5 expert reports that had all read the same surface, and none of them had thought to ask what was underneath it. She did not say anything for a long time. Isaac did not appear to require her to. It was while she was standing there in the space after the number and before the next thing either of them said that she noticed the photograph. It was taped to the wall above the secondary workbench, not framed, just taped at the corners, the edges slightly curled from years of temperature change in the garage. A color photograph slightly faded, showing a younger version of the man standing beside her. He was in a uniform she recognized as AMG, the Mercedes-AMG Performance Division Stuttgart, with a company ID clipped to his chest and the look of someone who was exactly where they had intended to be. Beside him, a woman leaned into his shoulder with the ease of someone who had leaned there many times, and cradled in his arms, wrapped in a yellow blanket, was a newborn. Below the photograph, written in black marker directly on the wall, in the same heavy ballpoint hand as the note on the gate. Nora. First day. Charlotte looked at the photograph for a moment, then at Isaac, who was cleaning a tool at the bench with a cloth and did not appear to be inviting the question. She asked it anyway. "Why did you leave Stuttgart?" He didn't answer immediately. He finished with the cloth, set the tool down, and turned to look at the photograph himself, not with the soft expression of someone lost in memory, but with the direct, appraising look of a person who has made a decision so many times in their mind that they have long since stopped questioning it. "My wife died when Nora was 9 months old," he said. "Brain aneurysm. No warning." He said it simply without the careful softening that people usually applied to that particular sequence of words, because the simplicity of it was the truth of it. "I had an offer to lead the powertrain diagnostics team in Stuttgart. Real work. The kind of problems you spend a career trying to get close to." He looked away from the photograph. "I had a 9-month-old daughter who had just lost her mother." Charlotte waited. "There was no decision," he said. "There was just what I was going to do." The bay was quiet except for the low hum of the work lights and the distant sound of the road. Charlotte had prepared herself on some level for a version of this conversation. She had known since the 5th day that Isaac Hayes was not a man who had ended up in a 2-car garage on Oak Creek Road by accident or failure. But preparation and arrival were different things, and she stood in the prepared space and felt the arrival anyway. "I want to offer you a position," she said. She did not apologize for the timing or frame it as something she had been thinking about. Chief Technical Officer, Voss Prestige Motors. Salary Equity, a dedicated diagnostic facility you design from the ground up. Whatever you need to work at the level you're capable of working at. Isaac looked at her. His expression did not change in any way that indicated surprise. "Nora's school is 3 blocks from here," he said. "I bring her lunch on Tuesdays. I sit with her class and eat with them because she asked me to, and her teacher said yes." He picked up the tool again and turned it in his hand. "There's no salary that replaces that." He said it without apology, without sentiment, without the particular performance of self-sacrifice that people sometimes deployed when they wanted credit for a hard choice. He said it the way he had said everything else this week, as a fact, cleanly measured, accurately reported. Charlotte nodded once. She did not push back, did not reframe the offer, did not suggest an arrangement that might accommodate both. She recognized in the way he had said it that the conversation was complete, not because he was closed to the world, but because the world he had built on Oak Creek Road was not a consolation prize for the one he had given up. It was the one he had chosen, and it was by any measure she could apply to it, not lesser. The DB-11 had been returned to the Voss facility that morning by the same flatbed service that had carried it to Oak Creek Road 7 days earlier. Charlotte had it detailed to the standard she maintained for every vehicle that left the building bearing the company name. Elliot Graves arrived on Friday afternoon, at the time Patrick had confirmed. Magnetic silver in the afternoon light. The interior exactly as it had been specified, every surface correct the clock face on the dashboard, showing the right time. Graves walked around it once the way he always walked around things. He was considering not inspecting, exactly more like getting his bearings, establishing his relationship to the object before committing to it. Then he got in, adjusted the seat by a fraction, and looked at Charlotte through the open window. "I'll take it out for 20 minutes, he said. "Stretch its legs." She handed him the key fob. He drove the route she had not described to him out through the north end of the city, up into the hills, where the road bent left around the long ridge. 22 minutes. The same road where 3 weeks earlier, a 73mm sensor had sent a false signal to an ECU that believed it, and a $280,000 car had pulled to the shoulder and gone quiet. The DB-11 came back up the facility driveway at a pace that said everything about how it had performed. Graves parked it, got out, and stood for a moment with one hand resting on the roof, looking at the car the way a person looks at something they have just been confirmed to believe in. "Who worked on it?" he said. Charlotte had thought about how to answer this on the drive over that morning. She had considered the full version, the 5 reports, the sensor, the firmware, the Stuttgart, call, the 7 days on a gravel driveway. And she had decided somewhere on the freeway that the full version was not the point. "An engineer, I trust," she said. Graves looked at her. Not at the car, at her. And in the way that people who have known each other for 10 years sometimes rid things without asking for them, he looked at her face and saw that something had shifted in it. Not the confidence was still there, the same register she had maintained across a decade of hard rooms. But underneath the confidence was something different from what had been there before. Not doubt. Something more like awareness, the kind that comes after a person has been wrong about the shape of a thing and has had the patience or the luck to find out before the damage was irreversible. He nodded. Once the way he had nodded 3 weeks ago on the side of the road level, unhurried, a gesture that contained more than it displayed. "Good," he said. That evening, Charlotte drove back to Oak Creek Road alone. She had not planned to. She had finished the afternoon's work signed off on 2 pending items and found herself on the freeway heading north before she had consciously decided to go anywhere in particular. The route was familiar now, in the way that short, repeated drives become familiar, the sequence of turns, the change in road quality, the particular shape of the tree line as Oak Creek Road began. The garage was closed. Both bay doors down the lights off the rusted chair empty beside the near bay. The driveway was dark, but the house beside the garage had its lights on warm yellow, the kind that comes from the inside of a kitchen or a dining room, rather than the cold overhead fluorescence of a workspace. Charlotte slowed without stopping, and through the window nearest the road, she could see 2 silhouettes at a table, one large, one small. The small one was talking. Even from the road through glass in the dark, the movement of it was unmistakable. The particular animation of a child who has something to say and is confident it will be received. The large silhouette was still, turned toward the small one, not eating, not looking at anything else in the room, simply listening with the complete unhurried attention of someone for whom that table and that voice were the only coordinates that mattered. Charlotte did not stop the car. She did not pull to the shoulder or cut the engine or sit with the window down. She let the scene move past her as she continued down Oak Creek Road, and she carried it with her onto the highway, and she drove home in the kind of silence that is not the absence of noise, but the presence of something that doesn't need to be spoken. She thought on that drive about what the week had actually taught her. Not about Isaac Hayes, though she would not forget him, or the way he worked, or the photograph with its 4 words written on a garage wall, but about herself, about the habit that 15 years of being right had built into her, without her noticing the tendency to move toward conclusions before the evidence was complete, to mistake the confidence of expertise for the accuracy of diagnosis, to hear 5 people say the same thing in 5 different voices and call that proof. She had not questioned the 5 reports because she had not believed there was anything to question. They were experts. They had agreed. Agreement, she had long understood, was not consensus. In the rigorous sense, it was 5 people working from the same information set arriving at the same conclusion, which was only as reliable as the information set they had each been given. And the information set had been incomplete, not because anyone had hidden anything, because no one had thought to look for what wasn't showing up. That was the thing Isaac had done that none of the others had. He had noticed the shape of the absence. When she got home, she opened her contacts and added Isaac Hayes' number, the one Maya had gotten that afternoon from her father's friend, the same person whose handwriting had started all of this on a torn piece of notepaper. She entered it under his name. In the notes field below the number, she typed 4 words and saved it. Do not call late.